Welcome back, everyone. In this second lecture on Charles Dickens' novel, Great Expectations, I'll be focusing mainly on the last two-thirds of the text. My focus will be on two aspects of those later volumes that, as you have probably noticed already, are quite different from the book's opening. The first is the shift in setting from the lonely marshes of Pip's small village in the Kentish countryside of England to the city of London. And the second is the accelerated pace of the story. These are big structural features that, as we will see, have a lot to do with each other. You might say for now that the middle part of the book is plot-driven, or that its continual series of events, its compounding of mysteries and subplots, joins the initial focus on Pip's undeveloped character by immersing him more actively in other people's stories. He is put into contact with more people, has more opportunity to try on new manners, form and break friendships, and confront his failures. The setting then echoes and amplifies what remains the book's central drama, that of Pip's evolving self-knowledge. To negotiate the alien complexities of London is to sort through the conflicts of one's moral universe, one's psyche, and one's status as a person of value. If at times the elaborate plotting of this part of the novel appears to overtake that central drama of the self, Pip's reflective, retrospective narration of these events grounds the reader in a consciousness that straddles the inner diegetic plane of the novel and the already processed meaning of those events by one standing outside and at some distance from them. And in a real sense, to miss this double vision is to miss the real artistry and insight of Dickens' novel. Whereas one thing we become aware of in Volume 2 is the unavoidable sense that some other story, some other more powerful agency is at work below the surface of what Pip can see. This really has always been the position of the reader in regard to Pip as the narrator. The narrator knows both stories, of course. The one Pip tells himself about the source and circumstances of his so-called great expectations, and the true facts of where his fortunes come from. The bifurcation of the narrative allows Pip to simulate living through the events as he believed he knew them at the time, which allows the reader to trace the gradual emergence of the character from a state of self-delusion or misinterpretation of the facts to that of clarity and true comprehension. The psychological evolution corresponds to the unraveling of the mysteries that Pip and the reader confront. And eventually, we resolve those mysteries as Pip does in the final volume of the novel. What we have in Great Expectations is detective fiction, but not in the sense of genre fiction exactly. The model that most usefully comes to mind in explaining what I mean is less a Sherlock Holmes type of mystery and more like the tragedy of Oedipus the King, who is made to discover he has unwittingly fulfilled a terrible prophecy by killing a man who turns out to be his own father and by marrying a woman who is actually his mother. But Great Expectations is also much more than Pip's story, and it can be read fruitfully in a number of other ways that I'll try to suggest today as well. As Dickens begins the second volume of Great Expectations, one phase of Pip's life is ending and a new one is beginning. Now, artistically and thematically, the narrative has reached a crucial point or juncture that requires a catalyst to propel it forward. Unlike, say, the genre of the short story that would come into greater prominence as the 19th century progressed, novels are roomy enough to change direction, explore subplots, and introduce new characters. Plus, they have to keep propelling themselves forward. So volume 2, in that case, has to yet again disrupt the status quo, reset Pip's life in another direction, but without violating some of the essential continuities of that life, which gives the book its coherence. The development might then be described not so much as a dying out of the younger, less experienced Pip and rebirth of an adult one, but more putting aside or submerging that younger self in the process of assuming a more public, more status conscious, performative persona. Another way to put this would be to say the split or the doubleness we have already begun seeing evidence of in the novel deepens considerably as we get into volume 2. So the question for us is, how does Dickens, as a writer, indicate these consequential shifts in the narrative? What other elements of the novel come into play to dramatize the stage of Pip's development that we begin to see later in the novel? Well, one way that I've already suggested is to change the setting from the countryside to the city of London, but another has to do with various kinds of name changes. I'm thinking of Herbert Pocket's new name for Pip, and I'm also thinking about the alias that is given to Magwitch, the name Provis. Before we launch, though, into a description of London in volume 2, notice the cleansing effect of Pip's tears as he departs his village on page 191 of the Broadview edition. Heaven knows we need never be ashamed of our tears, says Pip, for they are rain upon the blinding dust of earth, overlaying our hard hearts. I was better after I had cried than before, more sorry, more aware of my own ingratitude, more gentle. If I had cried before, I should have had Joe with me then. Now, another thing that Dickens registers in this putting aside of Pip's boyhood is the staggered movement of his leave-taking, which indicates a kind of reluctance. I'm quoting here again from that same page 191. When I was on the coach and it was clear of the town, I deliberated with an aching heart whether I would not get down when we changed horses and walk back and have another evening at home and a better parting. We changed, and I had not made up my mind and still reflected for my comfort that it would be practicable to get down and walk back when we changed again. And finally, the last line on page 192 ushers us expectantly into volume 2. I'm quoting here, and the mists had all solemnly risen now, and the world lay spread before me. The world, it turns out, is the city of London, a metonym, in a sense, for the rest of the world. So what does Pip first make of London, and what does it mean? On page 193, we have a beginning description that goes this way. We Britons had at that time particularly settled that it was treasonable to doubt our having and our being the best of everything. Otherwise, while I was scared by the immensity of London, I think I might have had some faint doubt whether it was not rather ugly, crooked, narrow, and dirty. These are, of course, purely physical descriptions on one level, but it's also possible to use these same adjectives in English to describe certain human traits. What I want to begin to suggest is that Dickens is one of those great writers of the city, part of a tradition that extends into the fiction of Émile Zola in France and Theodore Dreiser in the United States, among many others we could name. All of these masters of the urban environment, if you will, do much more than offer a photographic or documentary account of big cities, but what it feels like sensationally. We're talking about smells, tempos, obstructed views, darkness and light, human crowds, sounds of clopping horses, and belching furnaces. And maybe more importantly, the phenomenological effect of this urban environment on the way the human consciousness assembles its picture of reality. You'll note that what strikes Pip immediately is the city's immensity, which cannot be taken in all at once, but only felt or intuited. Metaphorically, this is a plausible way of imagining a world spread before me, as Pip says, that cannot yet be known. All the experiences, lessons, joys, setbacks that only lie in a state of potentiality. So the city as a mind that can intuit knowledge to come, but can finally never be fully known, because of the limitations of living one individual life among many other possible lives. The unexplored city full of secrets is analogous here to the underdeveloped mind and senses of Pip himself. When Dickens writes, quote, "It was treasonable to doubt our having and our being the best of everything," he seems to be linking the national belief in expecting the best with Pip's unquestioned belief in the great expectations that his benefactor has made available to him. But even in this same sentence, Pip registers a rather understated acknowledgement of his own disappointment with the ideal city of his imagination, a foreshadowing of his disillusionment with the money and social status he's come into. So the city itself is strangely associated here with the character that Dickens is most interested in bringing to life. Now, one thing that you yourselves may have noticed about the passages that describe Pip's first impressions of the city is that unexpectedly, it's not totally or completely urbanized or modernized. That is, Pip keeps noticing elements of farm industry and country life in what he sees. So for instance, on page 194, "I had scarcely had time to enjoy the coach and to think how like a straw yard it was. When he steps outside Mr. Jagger's office to see Smithfield, he encounters a great agricultural market, complete with cattle, pigs, and other barnyard animals. The place is, quote, all a smear with filth and fat and blood and foam that seems to stick to him." That's on page 196 again. The mechanism below the coachman's seat is called a harrow, which is also the word used for an agricultural tool with iron teeth used to plow fields. There are several ways of understanding this presence of the country within the city. One being that the city absorbs, appropriates, incorporates the tools and products of the countryside into its vast economy and its machinery of commodification. Because we are in the 1820s in this story, the Industrial Revolution and the consolidation of British colonial power has not yet taken full hold. So while the city is certainly quite different from the country that Pip comes from, it has these residual elements of that other place. In a sense, the in-betweenness of the city's development from one kind of economic way of life to another, more varied and modern one, you might say, seems roughly to correspond to Pip's evolution as a person. He goes from being an apprentice to the manual labor of the blacksmith forge to an educated young gentleman who, if he needs employment at all, would probably do some kind of mental labor. So for instance, we see at the opening of chapter 5, volume 3, the following description of a kind of transformation that's necessary to go from manual laboring with the body, the hands, etc., to kind of mental labor, intellectual labor in the city, kind of division within the person and what they're capable of. So I'll read you this quote. This is from 227. After 2 or 3 days, when I had established myself in my room and had gone backwards and forwards to London several times and had ordered all I wanted of my tradesmen, Mr. Pocket and I had a long talk together. He knew more of my intended career than I knew myself, for he referred to his having been told by Mr. Jaggers that I was not designed for any profession and that I should be well enough educated for my destiny if I could hold my own with the average of young men in prosperous circumstances. So it really is like the difference between Pip and Herbert Pocket, who's working in London as a clerk in an insurance office and planning for the future, and the young Pip who is working in the countryside at Joe's Forge. In a way, the forge, as I said the last time we met, represents an iconic image of tool making, a sort of almost primitive or archetypal kind of symbol here. But the fact that blacksmith forges make tools means that those are not products that are sold as commodities in and of themselves, but that they become a crucial element in the machinery that produces other kinds of commodities. So they're very fundamental commodities that are then sold throughout the city and then distributed to other regions of the country. You'll note then that what we see from Dickens' view of urban life, much labor goes into administrative work, legal contracts, laws and punishment of crime, commercial and financial transactions, all of which is skilled mental labor that renders much of the uneducated workforce poor and desperate. And again, this is a sign of a kind of massive sociological and historical and economic shift that's occurring, not just in England, but throughout the Western world and the United States as well. In turn, the city also shapes the human behavior of its workers. And I think this is where Dickens can be quite astute as a writer and a student of human nature. Splitting their personalities into machinery on the one hand and humanity on the other. And of course, the character who immediately comes to mind here is Mr. Wemmick, whose life is divided just along these kinds of lines. We get our first indication of this divided man on page 229. And this is Wemmick speaking to Pip. Tell him, Jaggers, that, and he'll take it as a compliment, answered Wemmick. He don't mean that you should know what to make of it. Oh, for I looked surprised. And then Wemmick says, it's not personal, it's professional, only professional. Well, this separation of personal family life from professional work in the city is particularly deep, as I say, in Wemmick, who has never once broached the fact that he has a father to Mr. Jaggers. So on page 239, we have this rather astonishing account of his little suburban home, which he calls the castle. Wemmick says to Pip, Jaggers has never seen it, never heard of it. Never seen the aged, never heard of him. No, the office is one thing and private life is another. When I go into the office, I leave the castle behind me. If it's not in any way disagreeable to you, you'll oblige me by doing the same. I don't wish it professionally spoken about. Now, this doesn't seem to me, at least, to be just a quirk of Wemmick's personality or something that he is in control of entirely. The modern conditions of administrative, paralegal labor requires a division of physical from mental labor. And so that kind of division moves outward to encompass other elements of life as well. So it requires that kind of mental work, that persons who perform it do so at certain times of the day, in certain stationary positions for a certain length of time, and in certain locations. The labor is organized, that is, by its relation to other associated industries in the distribution, say, of justice, if you're talking about law, other institutions related to the law, and rules of conduct that are shaped and regulated by professionalism or other kinds of expertise or training. With such division of labor and more mechanistic forms of work, the system of the legal world in this book, as in Dickens' other great masterpiece, Bleak House, takes on a logic and a life of its own, as it were. It becomes larger than any one person in it, although in this book, Dickens tends to embody that fearsome institution in an actual character, Mr. Jaggers. Now, it's true that there, as I say, other divisions as well, besides the one between private life and public working life. I said before that the cityscape alters the way Pip sees reality, and I want to explain a little bit what I mean by that. And that one of the alterations has to do with Pip's sense of increased visibility, of being looked at, watched, etc. In fact, in one part of the second volume, he's certain that somebody's been following him and watching him. That is, he is more conscious in the city of being seen, watched, followed, or evaluated by others. Now, Dickens makes surveillance itself part of the phenomenological and epistemological component of the city. It's part of the life of the city. Again, phenomenological means becoming conscious of reality through acts of perception of what can be seen. Epistemology is the science, the philosophical science of how we come to know what we know. Learning, how do we learn? Now, because cities are crowded with all different kinds of strangers, ways of knowing the people around you must involve reading the signs, reading their exteriors, reading their behaviors, etc., on a daily basis. Gestures, the way people speak, the way they dress. For example, these outward external signs that we must be alert to, hence the tendency towards surveillance on the part of the person in the city, looking, watching others. On the other hand, the one looked at can exert a level of control over how one will be looked at. Hence the conscious or unconscious cultivation of an outward persona or role playing that keeps the inner self protected from this kind of surveillance and judgment coming from the outside. Wemmick's method of separating his working self from his home self is just the most radical version of this split. There's a brilliant metaphorical description of this aspect of public surveillance on page 195, which offers us a view of Mr. Jaggers' inner sanctum, his law offices. And it goes this way. Mr. Jaggers' room was lighted by a skylight only and was a most dismal place. The skylight, eccentrically patched like a broken head, and the distorted adjoining houses looking as if they had twisted themselves to peep down at me through it. There were not so many papers about as I should have expected to see, and there were some odd objects about that I should not have expected to see, such as an old rusty pistol, a sword in a scabbard, several strange-looking boxes and packages, and two dreadful casts on a shelf of faces peculiarly swollen and twitchy about the nose. Mr. Jaggers' own high-backed chair was of a deadly black horsehair, with rows of brass nails round it, like a coffin, and I fancied I could see how he leaned back in it and bit his forefinger at the clients. The room was but small, and the clients seemed to have had a habit of backing up against the wall. I sat down in the cliental chair placed over against Mr. Jaggers' chair and became fascinated by the dismal atmosphere of the place. I called to mind that the clerk had the same air of knowing something to everybody else's disadvantage as his master had, unquote. Now, of course, this feeling that Pip reports makes perfect sense given his own relationship to these characters. It is a fact that they know more about Pip than he does at this point in the novel, but in a way, everybody has. The added significance of a passage of description like this one is that it suggests we are as much watched as watchers of other people. The leaning houses appear to be bent over to peer through Jaggers' skylight into his inner sanctum, even as Jaggers and Wemmick watch Pip's every movement in and around London. Now, the counterpoint to this rather dark atmosphere of surveillance, distrust, and suspicion is, of course, Herbert Pocket. Pip describes his friend as incapable of harboring secrets. The fact that Pip can recognize these qualities in Herbert suggests that he's not been, Pip, completely compromised by his new pretentious behavior and his ways of treating other people. He can genuinely see that Herbert is a good, supportive, and loyal person. At the beginning of Pip's move to London, it's Herbert who tells him that Miss Havisham has a backstory, and then he proceeds to tell and fill in the details of what happened to Miss Havisham as a young woman. Now, it's a trustworthy source of information, of course, because Herbert's father, Matthew Pocket, is Miss Havisham's relative, cousin. This family connection clears up the question about why Herbert is the first person that Pip meets when he is first summoned to Satis House. Miss Havisham has asked Herbert to be her companion, apparently, and possible suitor to Estella before asking Pip to fill these roles, presumably after Herbert has failed to do so in a way she deems acceptable. Herbert is also the last person to rename Pip, and he renames him Handel in reference to that composer's opera featuring a blacksmith, a kind of noble figure. If we place this act of renaming within the context of other acts of speech and language that I've been talking about as part of identity formation, we can understand that Pip's agreeing to be called this nickname given to him by someone who cares suggests yet another subject position for him to assume. This one, though, puts a kinder, more artful, nobler spin on Pip's background, humble background, correlating it with Pip's worthiness and providing him with a cluster of suggested positive traits that he can answer to and become. The very name pocket evokes a number of references to other kinds of pockets mentioned in the novel at crucial junctures. The emptying of Pip's pockets when Magwitch turns him violently upside down in that first dramatic scene with the escaped convict. Orlick, described as perpetually having his hands in his pockets. Pip hiding his soiled hands in his pockets, etc. It's less a figurative case of Herbert having Pip in his pocket as it is of a receptacle into which Pip can place his trust and loyalty. But there is another important contribution Herbert makes to the novel, and it has to do with Dickens' more serious critique of the socioeconomic limits imposed upon the clerical class or the middle class to which Herbert belongs. The way Herbert lays out his plans to be a capitalist, something he believes in strongly and optimistically, begins to fall apart as soon as Pip asks him a few questions about it. At that point, the reality of Herbert's prospects has nothing to do with his imagined future. The point I think Dickens is making is that something in this society, in this economy, in this culture, encourages fantasies of mobility, fantasies of financial security or even wealth and power, at the same time that the system of capital investment excludes or makes almost inaccessible the actualization of those fantasies. By way of contrast, the myth of rising makes all the more improbable the great expectations Pip has come into with barely any effort at all. Starting from a class position that's considerably lower than Herbert Pocket's, Pip nevertheless exceeds what Herbert can ever be. For Pip, his friendship with Herbert only exacerbates Pip's guilt, as if his unconscious discomfort with sudden wealth, unearned wealth, leads him to spend it recklessly and end up in debt as a kind of atonement. Pip ends up saying on page 366, "I am heavily in debt, very heavily for me, who have now no expectations, and I have been bred to no calling, and I am fit for nothing." Of course, this doesn't occur to Pip until much later in the novel, but there have been nervous signs and dark anxieties about money, unearned money, from the very beginning. You'll remember very early in the novel, Pip has an actual nightmare about money. So let's switch gears here a little bit to track the influence on Pip of what we've begun to think of as his surrogate parents, Magwitch and Miss Havisham. And remember, I said that they not only sort of fill the void of the missing parents for Pip in a certain way, but that each of them tends to represent large areas of the culture, large areas of, say, gender differentiation. So Miss Havisham, I argued, is a person who we associate with culture, with the interior of Satis House, with play, with singing, and the sort of feminine sphere of those kinds of attributes. And Magwitch, we first see him out in nature, almost like an animal. He is a criminal, as far as we know him. up to the later part of the book. Masculine male, works with his hands, etc. So there are these large symbolic spheres that are not just there to be symbolic, but to suggest that the proper integration of those very influential forces into the personality of Pip, they play a role there. And so it makes this fictional autobiography, in addition to the kind of self-development that's going on, it really is a commentary on a much broader level of society, a kind of commentary on society as well, that these kinds of oftentimes at odds kinds of attributes and spheres of life they must coexist more fluidly, or rather they have come to a point in the evolution of culture where they are becoming unnaturally separated too much. So in any case, because we've spent time talking about the significance of names that Dickens chooses for characters, which also is part of their symbolic weight, it's worth thinking about the fact that Miss Havisham is never given a Christian or first name. Perhaps equally worth thinking about are the name changes that Magwitch undergoes when he returns to England. Provis suggests the root of to provide for, or even providence, a more powerful association to the divine. Put this in the context of Miss Havisham's residence, Satis House, and you have provide for and enough, which is what satis means, to be satisfied, for instance, enough. So Provis is providing Pip with his expectations in terms of money, social mobility, training, becoming genteel, while something has already been satisfied by way of Miss Havisham. This seems all the more apparent when the bulk of Pip's expected inheritance from Magwitch never actually becomes his, but is confiscated, first by passing into an officer's hands after Magwitch struggles with Compeyson in the river near the end of the novel. And then we learn the property or money are forfeited to the crown. So on the other hand, despite Pip's belief that Miss Havisham has been his benefactor, which she hasn't, she does pay him for his services, which pays for his apprenticeship to Joe. And then she later agrees to fund Herbert Pocket's career, which supplements what Pip has already secretly funneled to that business without Herbert's knowledge. Later, we learn that Miss Havisham has altered her will to bequeath Matthew Pocket £4,000, which she has done after Pip has made a case for the Pockets. So finally, money goes into the most deserving pockets. So directly and indirectly, Miss Havisham does turn out to be Pip's benefactress, and Magwitch does not. It's ironic, but what does it mean? Well, given this, Magwitch does bequeath something other than what Wemmick calls portable property to Pip. Again, think of his given name, Abel Magwitch, the good son of Adam. Also, his initials denote the copulative verb of being, Abel Magwitch, A.M., am. And his declaration to Pip on page 346, looky here, Pip, I'm your second father, you're my son. more to me nor any son. A few pages later, this becomes more resonant when Pip says to Herbert, and I'm quoting, this is on page 368, "I know nothing of his life. It has almost made me mad to sit here of a night and see him before me, so bound up with my fortunes and misfortunes, and yet so unknown to me, except as the miserable wretch who terrified me 2 days in my childhood." This unknowable, almost godlike figure is both punishing and rewarding, like an Old Testament God. But there is a New Testament, Christ-like aspect to this father-son relationship as well. And this has to do with death and resurrection. When we first see Magwitch, he appears to be rising from the grave of little Pip's father. But as the novel nears its conclusion, Magwitch returns to England to see Pip spend his money, even though it means certain death for Magwitch. And there is the further circumstance of Pip's being forced twice to care for and protect a criminal, once as a child, of course, and later as an adult, which puts Pip in a kind of prototypically Christian position, helping this other man. So the care that he displays for Magwitch is similar and echoed in a minor register with the very solicitous care that Wemmick takes with his aged father as well. So it sort of reinforces, by way of a kind of background echo, the main connection between Magwitch and Pip. So how does volume 3 now seem different from the previous 2 volumes of the novel? Another way to put this is to think about what the novel's work is in the final volume as it proceeds to its conclusion. By conclusion, we can think about a couple of things. Obviously, the resolution of the plot, specifically the unraveling of certain knots, the solution to problems or mysteries that were laid out or hinted at previously. This is not to say the mysteries cease to emerge throughout volume 3, but they appear more rapidly and they get solved more quickly. Moreover, and more importantly, the mysteries in volume 3 connect back to fragmented information that's peppered throughout the previous volumes, dragging them up from the surface and pulling them into the unfolding plot of volume 3. So things are beginning to come together. The latent story is beginning to get excavated where it will join the surface of the flat facts of the plot of the novel. So on the level of what is unknown and known, unexplained and explained, this final part of the novel absorbs the information from the previous volumes in a unifying effect that is aesthetically satisfying. And it can also be seen as, in a way, the text swallowing itself. So to sum up, the central movement with regard to plot is greater clarity of knowledge. The kind of forward movement, or this kind of forward movement, is simultaneously a deepening, downward, vertical, philosophical movement. It is epistemological in a way. And the method Dickens uses to dramatize it is through the practice of detection. Pip must learn, in other words, to gather or seek out facts, details, past stories in an attempt to learn his own origins. These mental processes of interpreting correctly the people and the material world around him requires an active reading in the broadest sense of the term. In a very real sense, Pip's drive to gain a knowledge of his origins has always been and immersion in language. From the opening scene of the novel, he's featured reading the names of his dead family members from their tombstones. And this image does not just capture the pervasive function of reading and writing, it sets up a crisis, an epistemological crisis, by physically burying those family members beneath their names. The crisis in determining how we know what we know that this image establishes for the whole novel plays itself out structurally on the level of plot, in which, as I said previously, there is a manifest or visible set of actions, characters, understandings for Pip and the reader of the novel, and a latent or less visible plot involving characters who remain unknown, actions that take place out of sight or in the past, or behaviors that can't be read immediately for what they mean. Detection is an epistemological game of excavation and exposure, and 19th century novels tend increasingly to feature characters who are alert to details, who become experts in detection and ratiocination. As the century moves on, Dickens' great friend and fellow novelist Wilkie Collins would establish this genre with The Moonstone and other novels like The Woman in White. Mary Elizabeth Braddock would continue with Lady Audley's Secret, which features a character who becomes obsessed with exposing the dark past of a woman who rises in society through lies and deception. And of course, by the end of the century, the most iconic detective of all begins to appear in that series of novels by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Now, you might ask yourself why this kind of character achieved such prominence in the 19th century. Were there particular historical circumstances that created the conditions for such interest in detection, generally speaking? Well, I think to approach this question, it's helpful to think about the kinds of assumptions that underlie the approach to the world and to the nature of knowledge that we see developing in that century. If through rational detection, one can arrive at a foundation of truth, one has to believe in two things: that there is actually a truth to be discovered, and that truth is always obscured by delusions and misreadings that have to be swept aside or corrected. Delusions and misreadings are everywhere on the surface of experience and stubbornly fixed in the mind. The exercise of reason cuts through that surface. The evidence is shown either to be true or false. The adherence to delusion as truth is irrational, superstitious, fanciful, and leads to errors of judgment. So, for instance, on page 360, we see Dickens, in a way, incorporating this fairly categorical understanding of the difference between delusion and truth, when Jaggers reminds Pip of this same thing. So on 360, "As you say, Pip," returned Mr. Jaggers, turning his eyes upon me coolly and taking a bite at his forefinger, "I am not at all responsible for that." That is to say, Pip's belief that Miss Havisham was his benefactress. "And yet it looked so like it, sir," I pleaded with a downcast heart. "Not a particle of evidence, Pip," said Mr. Jaggers, shaking his head and gathering up his skirts. "Take nothing on its looks. Take everything on evidence. There's no better rule." Now, the rule here seems scientific. In other words, as opposed to, say, religious or hopeful or romantic. That would be in keeping with the growing consensus in England and other places in Western Europe around the prestige of the scientific method and simultaneous decline in religious belief. After all, the major scientific invention of the time included the publication of Charles Darwin's first important book on the origin of species in 1859. That's just 2 years before the publication of Great Expectations. Now, we can certainly talk at length about the historical background of the 19th century novel when we next turn to Middlemarch, but I just want to say that the decline in religion, and I don't want to make it sound like it was a very dramatic one, it's just a sort of more of an air of skepticism than was there before. That was precipitated by, and I think I said this before, a scholarly movement centered mainly in Germany that challenged the factuality of the Bible. Data from newly excavated archaeological sites in the Holy Land, for instance, combined with more rigorous biblical scholarship and translation studies, also appeared to erode the literal interpretation of these sacred texts. To come back around to how this emphasis on reasoning and methods of detection impact our understanding of Dickens, we can differentiate his realism from, say, another tradition in the novel, the Romance or the Gothic novel. By romance, I mean the kind of fictional narrative that includes characters and settings and situations that cannot be anchored in reality, verified by reality. This is not to say Gothic elements like mysterious castles, ghosts, and other improbable elements are completely stripped from the kind of literary realism that we're reading. There's plenty of this in Great Expectations, but the difference is that these apparently supernatural elements are eventually demystified through the process of detection and the training of reason. Reason, planning, division of labor, investing of capital all require a mix of speculation and rational thought. So it's not hard to see how the literary art of a culture so inclined is inseparable from and often in conflict with its own hyper-rationalized environment. In any case, this resolution of fantasy and reality is worked out in the third volume because the latent text is made to emerge into the manifest text to become one unified field of understanding. And one way to achieve this unity for Dickens is to interrupt, or maybe infuse is a better word, Pip's story with those of other stories. Backstories, often told by a voice other than Pip's, run almost seamlessly through the primary narrative as it reaches its conclusion. Much of the primary plot revolves around Pip's attempt to protect Magwitch from apprehension by the police. And this involves disguising him and name changes, Provis, then Campbell, and physically relocating him from Pip's rooms to a riverside location called Mill Pond Bank. And this plot involves Herbert and his fiancée, Clara. Then Startop, Wemmick, and a dangerous encounter with Orlick on the desolate marshes is also part of the fabric of the text at this point. So the plot in this third part of the novel is fueled by arrangements, by plans, by adjustments, and a sharp sense of the immediate moment. All the while this is happening, less visible characters come more fully into view. We learn Magwitch has a wife and child. We learn about his coming into the criminal enterprise of Compeyson. And through Compeyson, we have a link to Arthur Havisham, the half-brother of Miss Havisham. Compeyson and Arthur swindle and deceive young Miss Havisham, who had fallen in love with this forger. Meanwhile, Magwitch's wife murders her rival, and her small child is taken by her lawyer, Jaggers, and given up for adoption by another of his clients, Miss Havisham. Molly had threatened to destroy the child in an act of revenge on Magwitch, which leads him to believe he has no daughter. Miss Havisham names the child Estella and raises her as her heiress. Arthur is haunted by what he's done to his half-sister, and he dies. And Compeyson tracks down Magwitch to London, and Molly comes into Jaggers' employ. So the sort of loose threads of the backstory are now made visible. Plot is tied together. And we come out of the novel with this very satisfying sense of, oh, that's what happened. But I think that that feeling you get of resolved issues is tricky. And I think Dickens thinks that too. In other words, on the level of fiction, on the level of literature, on the level of fantasy and imagination, which is what literature comes from, it may seem that the problems of life are solved on that level. And then what we end up discovering is that they really don't. I mean, they may put things into perspective in a satisfying way, but they don't actually solve the problem. And this is what leads me to think about the ambiguity of the ending of the book. And I think that is one of the things, among a few other things, that I missed along the way in this lecture that we'll talk about on Thursday. So I will look forward to seeing you then and have a good discussion about the rest of Great Expectations before we leave it behind us.